another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. Every week for 1 hour to sometimes an hour and a half, we've been bringing you interesting information, I hope, things that might provoke your thinking and challenge you to learn a lot more about what's happening health-wise primarily, and the rest of the world, what's going on that affects your health. We've talked about all kinds of subjects up to this point, kind of a lot of more toward the health side, although we did do a series of 3 on modern psychiatry and psychology, and talked a lot about the things that are happening today, the direction things have been going. But today we are going to go into a very specialized aspect of the psychology, psychiatry, that type of thing, but from a very personalized viewpoint. We're going to be talking about a subject that has been intriguing to me for many, many years, and that is the subject of personal growth and human potential. Now, we'll define that a little bit more as we go, but for me, it goes way, way back. In order for us to uncover our potential as a human and to grow into what we could or should be, we have to, at some point, come to an awakening. There's some actually very scholarly psychologists and people studying so-called behavioral sciences that realize that at some point people can come to a crossover point that suddenly they see that they were living in a rather narrow, blind world. Now, one of the books talks about it as a trance. And in a sense, we have been put into a trance by those that we associate with, those with the family we were born into, and so forth. And many people never get out of that trance. But there is that day of awakening, and maybe watching this broadcast, probably 2 broadcasts, it's beginning to look like, we want to provoke you to open your eyes and look around and maybe see that the world is a lot bigger and broader and encompasses much, much more than what you ever thought. And of course, at the core of that, we want to awaken you so that you see where you are and where you might be. And that's, of course, not always easy. There's a writer that several years ago put out a book called The Crack in the Cosmic Egg. And the book was a result of an experience he had. He was an educator, had been in the field of education for many years, and thought he was educating people. And of course, you know, the word educate literally means to lead out of. It doesn't mean to brainwash. It doesn't mean to program you to think a certain way. It means actually to free you so that you can think. And so if you liken it to a trance, which I'm convinced that it's pretty much like that, we are born into a family, we grow up, we are programmed by them and all the people around us, and so we take on a certain worldview. And that worldview has to do with how we see things, how we believe things can happen and cannot happen. In other words, in a sense, we're in a box with a lot of walls around it. In fact, pretty high walls. And those walls kind of keep us from seeing that there's a lot more out there than what we realize. And one day something happens and it kind of, let's say a crack appears, and when you see through that crack, then all of a sudden you realize that you've been living in this little box. Now, the book I mentioned, Joseph Chilton Pearce was the author, and it was based on his own personal experience. Even though he was an educator, At some point he realized he really wasn't educating, and that there was a whole lot more that people needed to be aware of and see. Actually, I started way back in my 20s. All of a sudden, I began to realize that what I had been taught and the way I had been presented the world to be was certainly a lot different than what I later found out it was. It's been an exciting journey, and it's been enlightening. Things that I never thought were possible suddenly became possible, and it was very exciting once that started happening. Now, I was born in West Virginia, actually way out in the country. It wasn't next to nowhere, as you sometimes hear this phrase. It actually was nowhere. You had to leave this little town, you had to drive a 2-lane highway out of that town, turn off on a little gravel and tar 1-lane road and travel for some distance, which then turned into a 1-lane mud road for a lot more distance, and then you came to the foot of a mountain, and the mountain had a 1-lane clay road because the mountain had a lot of clay. And go up over that mountain down to the other side in the valley, and it was in that valley that I was born. Interestingly, when I was very young, and for the first few years of my life, I was not around kids of my age. My contact was with my parents and friends of the parents, and once in a while I might meet another kid for a while, but mostly I spent time with myself. So of course then I went into my own inner spaces to occupy myself, made a lot of my own toys. In fact, my investigations at that time were pretty limited because my parents had a very, very limited view of the world. They likewise both grew up on farms. In fact, my father was the same piece of property that I was born on. He was born, and we were just kind of away from everything. His family had been totally self-sufficient. They grew everything and hunted wild animals and fished and helped provide some of their own livelihood. They raised bees, they raised sugar cane, they grew all kinds of fruits and vegetables. They had trees of all kinds. They had their own water. They had a horse and a buggy for transportation. They didn't need gasoline. They didn't need insurance on their car. They didn't need insurance on their house. They built their own house. So basically, they didn't need money for anything. They just were able to totally provide their own living. The only thing they did out was that they would take some of the grain that they grew and take it to a mill and trade it so they could grind up the wheat to get some flour. But otherwise, everything was on the farm. My father, was his job to gather the hickory wood for the smokehouse. They smoked their own bacon. They smoked their own hams. And his mother basically was the family doctor. So he learned to gather herbs for her. So they just didn't need the outside world. So they did, in fact, have a very limited world. And that was passed on to me. Now, we did eventually get out into a small town, but that small town, it might have been a couple of thousand people total. May not have been that many. But that was my big exposure. When I got into school, it didn't take me long to realize there was a lot to learn just from being in school. But of course, the only books I had accessible were the books of the school library when I had an opportunity to go to the library. Otherwise, my parents were not readers. We did not have books at home, and our conversations, more often than not, involved everyday living, things that we had to do to maintain our house and live, and sometimes about my dad's work. And so I was kind of walking in a trance like pretty much everyone is in their early life. Now, as time went on, I began to have a desire to learn more, but in most cases it was not accessible. The little town we lived in did not have a library, and had it had a library, I would not have had access to it anyhow, because I would have had a long, long way to go to get to the library, because pretty much we walked every place. So it was the day that I left that whole area and moved to another state that had a lot more going on. That made a tremendous change, and my exposure to more things became much more broadened. So then it became very very enlightening, but still I hadn't reached that point where the big view had opened to me yet. It was interesting when some things came up that caused me to open my eyes and realize where I was and realize what I didn't know, or at least a lot of what I didn't know. And that started me on a trek. And that trek was to find out what was really out in the world. And so I took a big step upward in terms of world exposure and in terms of knowledge of the world. But still, there was a long way to go at that point. So my life, and I suspect it happens with most people if they do expand, is that it occurs that you have this period of time that you learn a lot of new things, and you wrestle with understanding them and bringing them into your world, and then at some point it kind of levels out. What you've learned, you kind of integrate it, and so that becomes your worldview. And so you function with that for a while, and then at some point you begin to realize that well, something happens that says, now wait a minute, you didn't have any idea that this even existed. And so then you start looking a little more. And so my big awakening came in my early 20s when I had gotten out of high school. I got a job as an analytical chemist. I was making some money, and that's when I started to purchase a lot of books on my own. And when that happened, that's when the big changes started to occur. For the first time, I realized there was a tremendous amount more to the world than what I had ever known. We had not been exposed to history except what little bit was taught in school, which was not a tremendous amount. We were not taught how to, at least at the school I went to, we were not taught how to look at the world critically, and how to gather information and how to sort it out and how to logically make some decision as to whether it might be valid or not. And it was around that time that I learned that everything that's out there isn't necessarily true. In fact, one of my friends has often referred to it as the big lie, that we are presented a viewpoint by, as I say, the educational system, and later companies you work for and the government. They all feed you what they think you should know to make you fit better into what you're doing for them. So they may train you in certain things, but the things that they train you in are for their benefit, either for a company to produce more or to make them more money, or for the government to not be a problem and do as you're told and not worry about it. And as time, of course, went on, even to the point that people would become very dependent on the government for their very livelihood. So that started me on this big journey, and it, as I say, it's been an exciting journey. Over the years, was taught certain things in school about science, and down the road, of course, it became outdated pretty fast. I know that there are many people who felt at the turn of the century that we pretty well had learned everything there was. We just had to iron out some little details here and there, but out of all that, we had a view of the world and a view of people and what people's capabilities were, and also what our limitations were. And as I look back, I remembered that we were programmed with a tremendous amount of limitations, all kinds of things that could not be done, and pretty much everyone I knew accepted that's the way the world was. You could do this, you could do that, but you couldn't do something else. And it wasn't until I started looking at the broader picture and I had that experience of realizing how much I didn't know and how much of the capabilities that we have, that it really started the big changes occurring. So over the years, after having trekked through a huge amount of, once cassette tapes came out, I ended up basically with hundreds and hundreds of cassette tapes about all kinds of subjects, and the cassette player made it very portable. But see, when I was young, none of that existed. The only electronics were a radio. There was no TV, and of course telephones. There were some around. They were very limited. In certain areas they did not exist. And eventually the very first telephones, of course, were party lines, and so everyone knew what everyone else was doing, because every time the phone rang, it rang at all the phones, and each one was supposed to have a certain code for them. But when someone else heard it ring, they knew somebody was going to be talking about something, so everyone picked up their phones, and sometimes it wasn't a two-way conversation. It might be a 5, 6, or 8, or 10-way conversation, and so there were no secrets over the telephone. So that was about it in electronics. The radios of the day, many of them out in the country, they didn't have electricity, and so the radios were battery operated. Later, my dad was able to purchase a radio that was both battery and or AC, because eventually, as we got into town, then AC current, as we call it today, alternating current, became available, and it changed things quite a bit. However, I still remember my first introduction to a recording device. And at that time, I would have probably been about 10 or 11 years old, somewhere in that range. And that recording device was a wire recorder. The very first recording device that I knew of was a spool of fine wire that ran through a recording head, and the recording was made on this wire. Now, of course, there were a lot of complications. If the wire broke, it was hard to splice two pieces of wire together for the recordings. And of course, eventually, Edison had discovered the gramophone type of device, which originally was a cylinder of a wax material, and you talked into a sort of a microphone that caused a vibration of a little metal plate, and on the edge of the plate was a needle, and the needle would cut little squiggly grooves in the wax cylinder, and later you could then put it on and put a needle in, and it would reverse the process and the sound would come out. Now, this was not electronic, it was purely mechanical. The vibrations vibrated a diaphragm, which of course caused vibrations of the air, and that produced sound. So when I saw this first wire recorder, it was at a state fair that we were having in West Virginia. And at that state fair, we were introduced to one of the newest inventions, which was the wire recorder. However, that didn't last so long, and it wasn't really so practical, and the wire could get tangled up, it would stop the recorder, and there were a lot of complications mechanically. So at some point, some industrious inventor realized that they could take a plastic strip and they could put a coating of iron oxide on it, and that iron oxide would record electromagnetic signals. And of course, that's the first electronics were in the wire and the tape recorder outside of radios. And So then we had tape recorders, which were reel-to-reel recorders. And they were very large. The old reels were 7 inches across, and some of the big commercial ones were 10 and 12 inches across. And so that was the recorder for a long time. Again, not practical. So at some point, then the 8-track came along, and the 8-track was similar to a reel-to-reel, except it was a repeat, almost like a repeat loop in a plastic case, and you plugged it in, and it wasn't too bad. It was an improvement. It made it more portable. But even then, it was large because it was probably about 4 to 5 inches across and maybe 6 inches long, and so it was pretty bulky. And suddenly somebody came up with the idea of the cassette tape. And so when the cassette tape came along, it became less expensive, it became even more portable, the players to play it were much smaller, and pretty soon you had a very portable device that you could learn a lot from. And all of a sudden they were putting lots of information on cassette tapes because they were inexpensive comparative-wise, and they were more portable. And so I was able to learn a lot more about the world and about all the different subjects that I was interested in. So I'm only telling you all that to say that gradually the doors have opened more and more things have become available, so that there's a lot of tools out there now, and those tools are very beneficial in helping to learn and to understand and to develop yourself. So we're talking about, as I said, personal growth and our human potential. So there's a lot to learn, and it's not just a matter of learning knowledge, it's a matter of learning about yourself and understanding what the research is. The research, it seems, at least in our society, is always probably 20 years ahead of the everyday practical use of things. And I don't care whether it's in medicine or whatever field it's in, it seems that there's always this lag between the information being made, let's say, found out about, and then being actually made available. And with all of that, and with the awareness that there was a lot I didn't know, that is what opened the door then for me to do what I call growing. And that's the whole thing about personal growth is, what can you do to, number one, uncover what your potentials are, and number two, how can you develop those? And it has a lot to do with your awareness and your flexibility. Now, I am convinced that most people today still are like the flea training and the fish tank training and the elephant training that goes on. Going back to the early childhood, you know, it's like you put fleas in a bottle, and you know that flea has the capability of jumping out of that bottle or jar. And so you put a piece of glass over the top of it, and so when they try to jump out, they hit the glass. And they keep doing that for a few days, and pretty soon you can remove the piece of glass, and they've now been trained that they can't jump beyond the mouth of the jar, and so they never jump out anymore. So they used to refer to that as flea training. Now they did some studies the same with fish. Halfway across the tank, they put a piece of glass, and so every time the fish would try to swim to the other side of the tank, they would bump against the glass. And after doing that for a while, you could remove the glass, and the fish would never go beyond that halfway point, because they already had learned you can't go beyond that, and if you try, you're going to get a bump on the head. And so they quit trying anymore. And I'm sure you know about the elephant training, which is the same way, in a sense, handled differently mechanically, but the same thing. When they're very young, they take a very strong chain and they tie them with that chain around 1 foot onto a post driven in the ground. And so if the elephant tries to go beyond the length of the chain, they can't. They're restrained. And so that is done every day. And after a while, as the elephant grows bigger and bigger, they don't increase the size of the chain. In fact, they can reduce it down to a very small chain, because now the elephant already has learned that you cannot pull or break loose from that chain. In fact, if you do try to do it, it squeezes your foot, and it's not real comfortable. So if you've been to a circus where they've elephants, you'll notice that this huge elephant actually has a very small chain around 1 foot to a little stake in the ground, and at any time that elephant wanted to, he could pull the stake out or break the chain with no problem. But he's already been trained that you can't do that. And so it's easy to control that elephant with a very small chain. So I think that most of us, at least it appears to me, have been trained in the same way. Our parents and so forth have told us this is the way the world is, and this is what you can do, and this is what you can't. And so what I'm wanting to do is to teach you that there is no separation of glass between the two sides of the fish tank, and there's no glass lid on the jar, and there's no big chain around your leg that restrains you. The only thing that restrains you is what you think the limits are. And so you've been programmed. Now, talk about programming and mind control and so forth. This definitely is one of the ways that people are kept in check, is that they're told what you can and can't do, and they accept that. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen some of the movies that have been out. There's a few that have been put out to teach about all of this. And if you haven't, I would suggest that it would be a worthwhile venture to rent or to acquire the movies and watch them. Of course, one is The Matrix. Some people have thought it's a ridiculous science fiction movie, but there's actually a lot in the movie. And there's a lot to help you break some of the programming so you can expand your vision. Now, it's been said that way back in the time of some of the early explorers, and including Charles Darwin, they traveled around and were looking at the different plants and animals around the world, and Charles Darwin was working on a theory about how we have evolved and how everything evolved. But it's been said that on one occasion, and again, I wasn't there, so I can't say it for absolute, but it's very likely true, that when they sailed into this one very primitive area, the people there, as they sailed up, could not see the ship they came in because they had never seen a ship like that before. When they got out of the ship and got into little boats and rowed to shore, they could see the people, but they couldn't figure out how they suddenly appeared out of nowhere and came to the shore, because a boat and a ship were out of their experience. And it only when he was there a while and the people were trained to look and focus would they be able to see the ship. And this has something to do with the way our brain organizes things. And if we don't have the right training to see something, we can't see it. And the training really is untraining. It's a matter of breaking those bonds and causing you to be able to focus better, that you can see it. Now, anybody that's done telescope work or microscope work realize that the more you work with a microscope, the more you can see. At the beginning, you look into the microscope at a sample of some sort, like a sample of blood. It doesn't make any difference what it is. And you have trouble seeing some of the detail that's there. But after you work with it for a long time and you keep attempting to see more, suddenly you realize there's a whole lot more there than you were seeing before. And so in either of those cases, it's because now we're expanding our capabilities. It's not that we didn't have the capability. It's just that we have to expand it sometimes because it's out of our programming. And we have to be careful because I don't know how many of you have ever read the book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. If you have not, I would suggest that you read it, and his later revised version, and it should be able to find them without a problem. But these men, many, many years ago, had some forward vision, and their forward vision showed them that the direction that society was taking, where it was ultimately headed. In other words, they were able to conclude, this is the way it's going, and here's what will be happening. And so in Brave New World, it ultimately got to the place in society that people no longer had choices. In fact, it was illegal to have children. They took the eggs and they fertilized them and they grew them in incubators. And in the process of those developing into an infant, they were beginning to program them. And the government had decided what each person was going to be in society. And you didn't have a choice. So if they needed a plumber, then you were going to be a plumber. And if they needed a doctor, then you were going to be a doctor. Whatever it was that there was going to be a need of, that's what you were programmed for. And so consequently, then your vision was very narrow. You weren't given choices. And ultimately, in order to keep people from rebelling or becoming unhappy with their lot, free hallucinogenic drugs of various sorts and drugs that would knock you out or put you in a stupor were dispensed freely to everyone, so that when they were not carrying out their assigned task, they could go off in Never Never Land and never cause trouble. So it's very interesting. They did make a movie of Brave New World. If you can find a copy of it, it would be worth watching. Now, I mentioned The Matrix already. The Matrix is again, an eye-opener if you really watch it thoroughly. But you have to do more than just one watching of it. I've talked to some people before, and I said, well, what did you think of such and such an idea that they presented? And they looked at me and said, I didn't see that. Well, it was there, but they didn't see it. So I always tell people, at least 3 to 5 times, you need to view that movie if you really want to catch what's going on, because once it gets started moving, things are moving very rapidly, and a lot of things are happening. And if you haven't been able to focus in and follow it, or if they presented something that you're kind of mentally wrestling with and they're onto something else, you miss a lot of it. So it's to me, it's an extremely good movie to point out how people can become blinded. And there's another movie that would be extremely good to watch. I'm only giving you some of these tools to begin with, to maybe they'll be eye-openers for you, or maybe they might start awakening you out of your trance. The other very good movie originally came out several years ago, called What the Bleep Do We Know? It was a very interesting movie. It actually had a plot to it, and it was about this lady who was a photographer, and that's how she made her living, and some experiences she had. And then as she has these different experiences and she's pondering about it, what's going on in her mind, she's trying to figure out, well, what's going on. They have various scientists, especially some quantum scientists, like Fred Alan Wolf, who's one of my favorites, and I would suggest that you get his books. Now later we're going to be talking about some of the books that are going to be extremely helpful in giving you information to open your vision. But at any rate, these various scientists come on and they discuss something about what's really going on scientifically that this lady is experiencing. So to me, that's a very good movie, and later they decided that maybe it was too much for some people, although it was shown around the country, and it was not a regular Hollywood production. This was a group of scientists and forward thinkers who put it together. They later made one called, or was a revision, I should say, of the original, called What the Bleep Down the Rabbit Hole. Now, the idea is that down the rabbit hole, you get a deeper and deeper view of things, and the deeper you go. So consequently, it's your choice as to how far down the rabbit hole you want to go, and so that's why it's called What the Bleep Down the Rabbit Hole. Extremely good movie, a good eye-opener, and it's interesting for not being a Hollywood production, and never got much press or played up big. Everywhere it showed, they had a sellout crowd, and in many cases, at the end of the movie, the whole audience stood up and applauded, because it is an eye-opener, and you're introduced to some things that can start you further on your journey. And that could become the crack for you to see through. Now, I mentioned Joseph Chilton Pearce in his book, The Crack in the Cosmic Egg, but what really happened to him, he had some strange experiences, and as a consequence of those experiences, he got the feeling that he had been in an eggshell encased, and that his whole world was inside that eggshell, and once there was a crack and he could see through it, he realized that there was a huge world out there. Now, after that, he wrote several books that were very interesting. He wrote a second book called Exploring the Crack in the Cosmic Egg. Then he wrote one called Magical Child, one called Magical Child Matures. Then he wrote one called The Biology of Transcendence, and he's continued to research, study, and write material that's for the purpose of opening your eyes and giving you a bigger view of the world. So I would like you, if you're interested, the whole thing about all this is that it has to do with how much you want to grow. I don't push people. I just say, here are some tools that you might want to look into, and if you're perfectly content with where you are and you don't want to move any further, then that's fine. But if you do find that it's rather limited and that it's not very fulfilling, your life isn't what you really would like it to be, then maybe getting on a path of personal growth or uncovering human potential might be a direction to take. My big book, I guess, when I first in my 20s got my eyes open, was called The Center of the Cyclone. And this book was written by Dr. John Lilly, who was an MD. He was I would say psychoneuro work. In other words, he studied the psyche, but also the neurology, the brain, nervous system, and so forth. Now, he has an interesting background, because his background was such that he was hired. He had such credentials. He was hired by the federal government to do a lot of research. And that research, to begin with, had to do with dolphins. In fact, it was in the Keys of Florida that he did a tremendous amount of study on the dolphins and the capabilities of the dolphins. And he wrote this, at least 2 books about it. One was Man and Dolphin, one was The Mind of Dolphin. And what he was figuring out was what were the real capabilities of dolphins. How well could they communicate, and how did they communicate? Because they have a much more expanded capability of communication among other dolphins. In fact, they have extremely large brains, and I doubt that we really totally understand what all they are capable of. And they can be trained to, as I'm sure if you've seen a dolphin show before, you've seen all the things that they can do. They understand language, and so he did all this heavy research. But then, as a part of his life, they decided to do something further. They wondered what would happen. Again, this was government-funded research. They wondered what would happen if you were put in an isolation tank where there was no sensations coming in through your normal senses. Now, that means that you were put in a water tank and suspended in water. They actually put magnesium sulfate, which is Epsom salts, which makes the water hold you up better. In other words, you're more buoyant. You float. And so he was put in water, and when you float, then you don't have a sensation of gravity. So that's one of the physical sensations that you don't have. You're in total darkness, so there's nothing, no images, no light coming in through your eyes, and there's no sound. the sound is all isolated. So you have no sound input, you have no visual input, and you have no sensory input, because even the temperature of the water was controlled in such a way that you had no sensation of warm or cold. It was at just the right temperature so that you could not perceive that you were in water. And so they wanted to measure what was happening to him and his brain under those kind of conditions. And once they had gathered some of that data, a new drug had been released on the market, and that drug was called LSD. Now, the drug company who developed that drug, I've mentioned before, later were the same company that produced Prozac. But they produced this drug, LSD, and they hoped to sell it. So here we had this research going on to see how it would cause your brain to act. And so not only then did he do the sensory deprivation tank, but then on top of it he ingested LSD at the same time. So the only reality he had in his brain was being generated by his own brain, since no sensory input was coming in from outside. It was whatever went on. So of course then your brain does not want to sit there doing nothing, so it's going to create its own reality. And then with the ingestion of the drug, then it got even more so. So this actually, the experiments with the isolation tank, which is what they were called at the time, and later became called as a flotation tank. And a lot of people have experienced the flotation tanks, but it does basically the same thing. There's no sensory input coming in. You're in total darkness, total sound isolation, and no sensation of gravity. So there you are, like you're being suspended in nowhere, so to speak. And so that started John Lilly on a trek of wanting to find out more of what really goes on and what our capabilities are. So he wrote a series of books, and that's going to be on a book list. I've been working on compiling a very good book list of books that are helpful to point out some of the things that really can be done. And so his first book that I received was The Center of the Cyclone, which is an autobiography of some of the things we're just talking about. He talked about his experience at doing all these things. And so then later he wrote one about he and his wife called The Dyadic Cyclone. Before that he had written a book called Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer. And he likened the brain to a biocomputer or a computer, and computers were starting to come out, the early versions. And so you had to program them. And so the program is, of course, what you put in to carry out some task. But then he realized that there were different hierarchies or levels of programming. And so he referred to programming and metaprogramming. So metaprograms are programs that are above the programs. And then you have meta-metaprograms. And so each of the higher level programs have automatic controls that can kick in to control the very basic programs. And so one of those, for example, is survival. If we are put into a very threatening position that could be life-threatening, many times this metaprogram takes over and controls the whole way we respond to that. Whether we run fast or whether we come up with some rapid plan to avoid a disaster or whatever it is. You know, it's like if you were in one of these big tsunami areas and you suddenly look up and see a tsunami wave coming, your survival mechanism will kick in and you will start getting out of the way, if you can at all, if there's some way to avoid it. And you know, they make use of this with infants when they teach infants how to learn to swim. They automatically, when they're put in water and they start to sink, they start moving their arms and legs and they hold their breath. And they don't have to think about it. And so there's several swimming programs for infants. Now, when my dad was young, there were some families that he knew that had very large families, and they wanted them not to ever drown. So they took them out to these large water tanks when they were infants, and this is before all these other studies came along, and they would just throw the baby in. And pretty soon the baby is swimming. But now, if you're older, see, and you're put in water, then our conscious mind says, now wait a minute, I can't swim, and guess what can happen? You can drown because you don't know how to swim. But it was an automatic reflex in a meta-program. And so he wrote this book about all of the programming and meta-programming, which I thought was a very good book. He wrote one called The Deep Self, which was about later, after he learned all this isolation tank material, he then decided to develop what was called a flotation tank that would do the same thing, but of course at a lot less money. And people could go to centers where these flotation tanks were there and could basically rent time in the tank. So you would go in the tank, and as I say, you would float on, instead of being totally immersed in water, you would float in water that was a high concentration of Epsom salts, and you could not sink in it. You would float near the top of the water. So you could just relax and lay back, and you would not sink, and you would not drown. Then it was insulated for sound, and it also was totally dark. So once you're inside, there was no more information coming in from the outside. Now, you might wonder, what's the value of this? And the value is that, as I said, the brain at that point begins to all of a sudden create its own reality. It's not going to be there idle with nothing happening, so it starts to create. So it actually helped people gain insights about themselves, and maybe some of their old problems came up, and they developed an insight on how to deal with that problem, how to resolve it. So there were great benefits. Pretty much all the people who went in the tanks had good experiences. There were a few that instead of relaxing, they immediately went into a panic mode, and they had to get out very fast. And you could, because you weren't locked in the tank, you could open and get out if you wanted to. But it was a way of helping you to get into your brain at a deeper level, and your mind. And today we're not even going to be talking about the mind-brain issue. The mind-brain has a lot to do with whether the mind is a creation of the brain or an artifact of the brain, or whether the mind is separate from the brain, or whether the mind works through the brain. And I have to say, from all the evidence that I have seen, and from my own personal experience, and from many other people's experiences, that the mind is not part of the brain, but it does work through the brain. And of course, some of the other things we talked about before, the work of Candace Pert, is that the memory is not all stored in the cells in the brain, as most people think, but is scattered throughout the whole body and stored in all the cells of the body. Now today we don't have time to talk about all the ramifications and evidence that this is true, but that is my conclusion after having studied in this field for years and years. I have a huge background in psychology, behavioral sciences, psychiatry, and mind-altering drugs, and psychopharmacology, and all the things that go with it. And after having looked at all this and looked at some real-life events that have happened to people, I have reached a certain set of conclusions, at least that satisfy me at this point, as to how it all works. We talked a little bit about it when we did the psychiatry-psychology series, but at some point maybe we'll get into it more, and maybe a little bit even on the next session of what we're going to be talking about with this subject of personal growth, or the human potential. Now, I guess I ought to throw in at this point something that, I'm always researching, I'm always on the internet. I probably use reams of paper every month, printing out all this material. I have notebooks and file folders full of material. I'm constantly wanting to know what is happening, if there's any new evidence, if there's any new research, and if so, how does it fit with what we have already learned or thought we knew, and maybe find that it wasn't true. And just one of those, for example, I was taught for years that the brain continually matures up to about late teens, and then it reaches a finished level, so to speak. And after that, brain cells die off and we start to go downhill. And if you damage the brain, there is no repair because you don't grow new neurons and that's it. And that was taught by medicine for years. And lo and behold, all of a sudden now, all the new research coming out says that's not true. You can grow new neurons. You can grow new neural networks in the brain. You can grow more axons and dendrites. You can do all those things that they said it was impossible. You couldn't do it. And when we talk about impossible, why, you need to think back, if you're a bug of history at all. I was around when Roger Bannister broke the first 4-minute mile. Now, the interesting thing about that was that up to that point, it was a barrier. No one could run a mile in less than 4 minutes. It was impossible. It was so impossible that even medical doctors got involved and said, if you did, you would die because you would overexert the body so much that you could not stand to break a 4-minute mile. And so for many years, that in track and field, that was the barrier. You could not run a mile under 4 minutes. And all of a sudden, by some quirk, Roger Bannister out of England ran a mile in a little less than 4 minutes. And immediately, within the next few weeks, several runners who for years could not run a mile faster than 4 minutes suddenly could run a mile faster than 4 minutes. And not one of them dropped dead. And it was just interesting to see about these artificial barriers getting back at what we said earlier that have been placed on us. And we are told, nope, you can't do that. That's the limit. I read about the next one I'll throw in real fast because this one wasn't of my time. It was before that, but when the automobile was developed, there's a thing about man and machines that if there's a machine out there, somebody's going to try to push it to whatever its limits are and find out what they are. And so at some point they decided to set up racetracks and start racing cars. Well, anyhow, the early cars, I don't know if you've seen pictures of them or not, but they were pretty big, monstrous, heavy-looking things with great big wheels on them. And so most of the racing, was at 40 to 50 miles an hour. And so there were some race drivers who said, we're going to go faster than that. We're going to go to 60 miles an hour. We're going to go a mile a minute. And they were told, you can't do that. It's impossible. You cannot drive a machine a mile a minute. It would be devastating. It could kill you. And of course, guess what? Medical doctors jumped in and said, oh yes, if you're driving at 60 miles an hour, a mile a minute, the pressure is going to push the air out of your lungs and you're going to die. Now you go tell that to somebody now that drives 240 miles an hour on some of the modern race tracks, whether they can do that or not. In fact, you tell the man who out on the Salt Lake Flats in Utah drove a jet car at over 600 miles an hour. So you tell me whether that happens or not. So I'm only saying is all of these limits that have been imposed, for whatever reason, I kind of think that mankind as a whole, there are exceptions around the world, but I kind of think mankind as a whole tends to be negative in outlook. They're always looking for the what you cannot do's as opposed to what you can do's. And it's only a few people who are much more forward-thinking who come along and say, yeah, you can do that. And they do. And I have seen it broken so many times with all the barriers. Another barrier I just happened to think that I thought was interesting. In my younger years when I was learning about herbs, there were a lot of people into natural medicine and herbs who made preparations that you put on the skin to affect the inside of the body. And guess what they were told by medicine? This is quackery. We know that the body has a barrier with the skin that will not allow anything to penetrate that skin, and therefore this is quackery to think you can put a patch on the skin and it will have an effect inside the body. But guess what today? How many patches for hormones and nitroglycerin and all of these drugs are out there that you can put on the skin, and it goes through the skin, and it does have an effect on the inside of the body. But for years, I remember they were saying how crazy people were in herbal medicine to try to tell people that you could put something on the outside and it would of the skin and it would affect the body internally. So I'm just laughing in a sense about all the barriers. I have to say that there were forward-thinking people way back, way back beyond what people would think. I have in my library a list of 3,000 years of different individuals who understood body-mind relationships, of how the mind affects the body and so forth. And the Chinese, who knew it was both ways. They knew that an organ could turn on an emotion, or that an emotion could affect an organ function. And so all this was known for thousands of years, but yet today it's still barely known except in small circles of what these relationships are, but yet they knew them. Now, it's interesting, as I say, we have such a negative society. As I was kind of digging through, I ran into an article. This was written out of the UK, and it was written by a group called apologetics.net, ukapologetics.net. Now, that means it's religious in nature, because apologetics is a branch of religion that has to do with defending the faith, so to speak. And anyhow, I'll tell you a little bit about that. This article was written some time back and posted on the internet, called The Dangers of the Human Potential Movement. So, one thing that I have practiced over the years is that I always want to know what is the critique, what are the grounds of criticism of anything that I have believed. So I want to know, do they have any real evidence? Is it hearsay? Is it pure prejudice? What is the critique? One thing right off that caught my attention is when somebody says, I have it on good authority. That means they're working from hearsay. That means they didn't go do it themselves, they didn't look into it themselves, they listened to some things somebody else told them, and based on that they have reached a series of conclusions and published this whole critique. It says, dangers of the human potential movement. What is the human potential movement? Where did it come from? How did Nietzschean psychology get into business seminars? What are the dangers of human potential teachings? Now, they have come up with, I don't know, that this came out of the human potential movement, which actually began in the 60s when some of the discoveries of psychology and things about the human psyche and so forth were more and more uncovered, caused them to revise some of the methods of psychotherapy. But some of it wasn't just from the 60s. Carl Jung laid the groundwork for a lot of this, and he goes way back earlier with Freud. He and Freud were contemporary. Freud tried to talk everybody well, although Freud really wasn't a therapist, he was a researcher, but his approach was analysis and talk. But Jung took it a whole lot further. He's probably one of the broadest thinking and probably most knowledgeable, historically as well as contemporary, persons in the whole field of the mind and psychology to understand it. I believe it was his term that he called it analytical psychology, what he did, but he incorporated a lot of things and had a much broader understanding of humankind than Freud. Freud was pretty well limited to the ego, superego, and the id, and they repressed sexuality and how the people developed neuroses and hysterical health problems and so forth based on that. And I'm not criticizing Freud, because Freud came in at a period of time when people who had mental and emotional problems were considered to have brain fever and they were incurable, and the only thing to do was chain them up in a dungeon and throw some food into them, and that's all they needed till they died. And so Freud was able to say, wait a minute, there's something going on here. It's not something that cannot be corrected or cured. It's not a fever. this person has some emotional conflicts, and he opened a whole new realm as far as understanding the mind and the mechanisms of the mind. I'm not saying he knew all the answers, but he certainly pulled these poor people out of the dungeon and chains and gave them a chance to get some exposures that they could get well. But at any rate, Carl Jung had just such a broad, and we're going to be talking more about it the next time. But anyhow, this person who wrote this, I guess it was a lady. I was looking at the end of the article, and might not be. The name is Robin, so it could be used where male or female. So I don't want to sound prejudiced that I thought some lady wrote it. It could have been a man. Anyhow, somehow the writer gleaned this and said, the human potential movement is distinguished by various emphases. Now, again, I'm pretty sure that most of this is based on hearsay, because the writer is already saying they have it on good authority, which means it's hearsay. But anyhow, they're saying a focus on each person being independent and autonomous growth, which in parentheses says Nietzschean, rather than reshaping individuals to fit society's requirements, needs, or demands. I don't know that sounds so bad to me. Why do we need to be reshaped to fit society's requirements, needs, and demands? Why not maybe society be shifted for individuals? A holistic approach concerned with all levels of human functioning, not just the intellectual, including creative and spiritual functioning. Now here, they're saying that they talk about spiritual functioning, but then later this writer turns around and says they're atheists. So, I don't know, that doesn't make good sense. Anyhow, also it says there's a focus on good psychological health, and then in parentheses the writer wrote whatever that might mean. Well, I guess good psychological health would probably mean good psychological health, and it doesn't seem to me that might be such a bad thing. A focus on liberation from repression and feelings of guilt and self-doubt. A clear combination of Freudian and Nietzschean anti-religious influences. Now, I don't think religion had anything to do with that at all, neither in Freud's case or Nietzsche. But somehow even after they said they emphasize spiritual functioning, they turn around and try to make out like they are atheistic and anti-religious. And also they said a commitment to the belief that the human mind has a much larger capacity than most people ever realize or utilize. Now that doesn't sound bad to me either, so I don't know why this is so dangerous. And then, of course, not originally part of the mix, but modern version of the human potential movement, usually. Now, notice that usually, and usually when people say usually, they're going to turn around and generalize instead of saying sometimes, because what that really means is sometimes or maybe even many times. It ties self-actualization into the business and financial success. Well, yeah, some corporations have incorporated methods of helping people become better at working for the company and hence make more money for the company, and I don't know that that's necessarily bad either. So, after saying they have it on good authority, they say, well, you know, a lot of these companies and organizations are using this, and therefore there's no doubt they're using mind control techniques that cults use. So now all of a sudden they're throwing in something that out of the realm of logic is called poisoning the wells, you know. I don't know if you've ever studied formal logic, but they're called fallacies of logic. One I just already mentioned, going from some or many to all. That's a generalization, and it's not valid logic. And also to say that because some companies use it, that it's number one, mind control. It may or may not be. I don't know how they're using it, so I can't even comment on it. But that the cults use. So you know, that is what's called a prejudicial term, to use a pejorative word which has a negative connotation, to say that if cults use it, it's got to be bad. And these people are using it, therefore they're like a cult, and it's bad. So I don't know if that's true. Anyhow, after having read through this whole article, it seems to me that somebody is very narrow-minded and prejudiced and didn't really examine it themselves. And it's true that if businesses are teaching people how to expand their capabilities and do a better job of selling, the companies are going to make more money. But guess what? So aren't the people who are doing the selling. So I think both people are benefiting, so I don't really see that as bad either. Anyhow, I guess we're about run out of time here again. And so I'm not going to have time to conclude everything I was going to conclude, except to say that in the next session, we're going to get into some of the more specific tools and writers and books and things and programs, whatever, that you might utilize if you're interested. Now remember, it's always whether you come out of your trance and whether you want to get a bigger view of the world and whether you want to expand yourself. That's your choice. And so we're going to give you some tools and some ways of doing that. And we did talk about, since they brought up about the mind programming, there is a very good book out by an acquaintance of mine by the name of Eldon Taylor, who has spent years studying the mind, and it's called Mind Programming. Now in that book he talks about what are the principles of mind programming, how do advertisers use it, and these people are being burned with it every day with advertising, and it's true. And he talks about what it is, and then he talks about, okay, now that's the bad side of it. What's the good side of all of this mind programming stuff? In other words, if you voluntarily are using programming techniques to improve yourself, I don't see that that's bad. All that means is you understand how the mind works and you're making use of mind functioning principles to improve yourself. That's voluntary. It's certainly in your awareness and knowledge, so it's not something being done to you. It's something you can utilize if you want to improve yourself. And so Eldon Taylor talks a lot about what are the good uses of all this. So if you really want to get into mind programming, you might want to read his book. I guess we're about to run out of time. For some reason, I always have more material than we have time. So next week, we'll be looking forward to you. Don't forget to go to our site, mindyourhealthcast.com. If you want to do this program direct from there, you can click there. If you want to go direct to the program, you can go to freedocast.com/mindyourhealthcast, and that will get you right to our video. Otherwise, go and look through our site, and if you're interested in the clinical side of my clinic and the things I do, you can click also from mindyourhealthcast.com to Alternative Health and Prevention and go to that website if you want to find out more about the clinical side. It was nice being with you again. As I say, we always seem to run out of time. However, we're trying to keep this more to, and we are, closer to 1 hour. Occasionally we still run over a bit. So until next time, happy programming.